Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are streaming live now. This is the 172nd, 172 sessions of I Need Living Conversations. I am your host or companion or the person who introduces the conversation. I'm Julian Katari, and Sacred Blue Heron Woman is with me, with whom we have a conversation each week regarding many different things about the world, the state of the world, and how to find freedom from a long age, an era of darkness. How can we surpass this time of darkness we are living in right now? There's so many aspects of that. And for 8 sessions now, we've been covering into the depths of the abyss of the system in the absence of the sacred. So we live in the absence of the sacred. We live patriarchal religions that have nothing to do with the real sacred. And we're pulling the strings on this. We are working to find out what happened, what has happened, how does this work. Lots of investigation, lots of research is being done, and we come here each week to share that research with you. So please find a comfortable spot and get ready for this amazing piece of information about the abyss of the system. Welcome.
Yeah, and as I've been reading and studying, it's really coming to me that the sacred is Munaiki. It really is Munaiki. It's nothing, it's not a god, it's not a goddess, it's not Great Mother, it's the glue that holds us all together is Munaiki. And the very sick men who are do all this misery planning are sick because they're so freaking disconnected from love.
Yeah.
If you stand in love, you can't do what they do.
Mm-hmm.
You can't make the moves that Trump is making. You can't do what Elon Musk is doing. You just can't.
Have you thought about what if they're just hurt kids and they just need love?
They are. That's all. That's exactly how I see both Trump and Elon Musk are acting like little 13-year-old boys in the candy shop.
Right. So I would ask how can we love them so they stop being like that? But maybe that's not the shortest way, or that's not even possible. But what is possible is stepping away. You talk a lot about that, stepping away,
walking away from the system.
from this system. So
I think the best way to love them is not to proclaim them evil, but to say that they're just hurt little boys. You can see that underneath everything that they are hurt, bewildered little boys who have no clue what love is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and you can tell that a big role in that hurt has been this. I mean, from Elon, I totally see the influence of a satanic cult being kind of what's behind it. And I haven't seen that for Trump as much, but then in a way, religions also are the same thing in a way.
They are. They believe in Satan. So, I mean, there's the Church of Satan, which is the absolute reverse of supposedly of religion, but of Christians that believe in God. But all the Christians that believe in God believe in this vengeful, wrathful God. So is that not Satan?
Yeah. And you've been talking to me about that on the messages, and it's really spot on. This revenge, this I will punish you energy, and it's so embedded in us. It's like we're constantly we fall into that archetype so much. We constantly feel fear, we feel depressed because and especially when you're breaking away from the system. Because if you're just flowing with it, you might just find this bubble of I'm doing what I'm told kind of thing. But when you break away from it, you really start getting invaded with energies and things that are telling you you're being sinful, you're being wrong, you're making it, and you constantly try to find ways to feel bad.
Yeah. Well, misery planning is, yeah. Okay, so I'll tell you a friend this weekend. Um, right, I took him out we went out to eat on Friday together, and he was already into beer, and so he didn't eat, but I ate, and we went to La Finca, the Mexican restaurant, and he had a few beers, and I told him I was paying for it because he'd been home for the whole week due to the cold and wasn't getting paid,
Mm-hmm.
and so we left, and I went to get the restaurant, and I had to get feed, and I had to get milk for the goat kids and this and that, right? And he was going to come over to my place and help me and hang out with me the rest of the afternoon. But he wanted to go to his house first and get his truck. Well, on the way to Eufaula, he had been talking to me about this friend who had seen, apparently she had some tickets that she had unpaid, and so therefore was probably warrants out for her arrest. And she had seen this website that said, if you just come in, we'll absolve you and not arrest you. So he was worried about her. And we both decided that, well, if she was stupid enough to go in and believe that we'll absolve you, then right? So I'd left it at that, never thought about it, and dropped him off at his house. And of course, he didn't show up, which wasn't surprising to me. He called me the next morning, and in the background, I hear a woman's voice. And I was like, this is interesting. And he's like, I want to do a pig on Sunday early in the morning because I want to take it to Tulsa, and my dad and I are going to scald it and make chicharrone. I'm like, okay. And he's like, I'll probably come by later today, but I'm hearing her voice in the background. So a little bit later, I called him to say, hey, it's going to warm up fairly decent this afternoon. Tomorrow's still going to be pretty cold. Sunday's going to be pretty cold in the morning. This was Saturday. Why don't you come over this afternoon and we'll do the pig? So that's what I was intending to tell him. And instead, I hear the phone gets answered, but I hear all this muffled something going on. And then I hear her voice going, Jaime, it's your phone. Jaime, it's your phone. And then I hear this like an inhale and and instantly I got this flash of he just snorted a line of Coke.
Okay.
Right. So I hung up, and I was panicked. I was like, what the fuck? Right. So I went for a walk to calm myself down, and then I called him again, and he answered. And I'm like, I need you to be honest with me. Did you just snort Coke? And he's like, what the fuck are you talking about? I'm like, Jaime, I just called you, and all I heard was snuffling. And he's like, oh, no, hell no. And then he hangs up on me. Like, okay. So I was going through all this, right? And then later on in the afternoon, I decided to misery plan for myself. And I drive by his house, and I see her truck. I see a truck, right? Okay. So I come home. I went to get money for hay. I come home, and I decide to try to mask my phone call as star 69 so he couldn't tell who was calling. She answered the phone. And so I just sat there in silence, and then he answers and took the phone from her and was like, hello, hello, hello. And I just sat there in silence, didn't say anything. And then he hangs up, and star 67 must not have worked because he instantly texts me and says, do you need help? What's going on? You need help? And for the next several hours, I found myself going through this misery planning. Oh my God, that was, to me, it was like misery planning is like programmed into us. It's right. But, and then it was, then the thing came was like, Ingrid, you're freaking 57 years old and you're jealous. What kind of a leader are you if you're a crone, so to speak, now, the old lady, and you're not wise enough to not be jealous? So I just worked through everything. I'd listened to Dispenza conversation where he's like, you go into these old survival patterns, and and you're feeling fearful with a rejection like that because now you're on your own, right?
Mhm.
Supposed surviving on your own. And I went, no, I'm not feeling that. And what later came to mind was that when he had hung up on me, he'd walked out, right? And that pisses me off.
Mhm.
Right? Same thing as Father Gregory Boyle at Home by Industry. Don't fucking walk out on me. Stay and let's finish the conversation.
Mhm.
Let me hear the truth, right? I'm not blaming him, but I wouldn't have spiraled into this misery planning if he had just had the balls to tell me what's going on in my world.
Right. And there's probably a reason for that. So
Yeah. So anyway, that's my point with this, is not to point fingers at him or to me. But then I was reading, I think it was either from the Clan Mothers or it was from from something about the Mayan calendar,
Mhm.
that said the woman that can hold her emotions and wade through them and allow herself to be with them is one of the most powerful women in the world. And I sat with that for a while, and I was like, you know what? That's true, because I'd been told in the Army uh, just before I got kicked out, well, you come in with storm clouds all over your face, because I was sad because I'd just broken up with the guy I'd been seeing. He'd just broken up with me, right? And
Mhm.
the male major counseling me was like, you can't do that as a leader. You can't do that. You can't ever show emotion. So this weekend it came to me that yes, actually, if we want to teach people to deal with their emotions, the leaders have to show that they're emotional,
Hmm.
but they can deal with it. And they can deal with it without, because if you don't show your emotions, then the saying comes, the shit rolls downhill. And that's where we get also the saying of, well, who's shitting your cornflakes this morning? Because they come into work and don't let you know that they're hurting, but they let you know that they're hurting because they shit all over you.
Hmm.
So wouldn't it be a better leader to show that you're emotional and saying, I'm having a really hard day and I'm going to do my best not to shit on you.
That's such a challenge to be a good leader. Everybody wants
Not
to
to
be
seek
led.
revenge. That was the other thing, revenge seeking.
Hmm.
I was all
Mhm.
about wanting to find revenge on him right? And that's where it comes from. If we're not sitting with our emotions, then we're going to revenge, and the shit rolls downhill. We're going to shit on those beneath us.
Mhm. Wow. Okay, so we're gonna learn about the system and
Yeah,
how
we're
that
going to
this
get back
system
to
brought us into this,
yeah,
right?
exactly. How that's kind of the whole purpose of this story, is this misery planning has been so programmed into us that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're moving on now to Poland, China, South Africa, and Russia.
Okay.
So before the Berlin Wall fell and became the defining symbol of the collapse of communism, there was another image that held the promise of Soviet barriers coming down. It was a guy named Lech Walesa, however you say it, a laid-off electrician with a handlebar mustache and disheveled hair, climbing over a steel fence festooned with flowers and flags in Poland. The fence protected the Lenin shipyards and thousands of workers who had barricaded themselves inside to protest the Communist Party decision to raise the price of meat.
Mm-hmm.
As the strike wore on, the shipyard became a pocket of popular democracy within an authoritarian country, and the workers expanded their demands. They no longer wanted their work lives controlled by party apparatchiks claiming to speak for the working class. They wanted their own independent trade union and decided to call it Solidarity. This was 1980, and Lech Walesa was Solidarity's leader.
Mm-hmm.
Solidarity spread throughout the country's mines, shipyards, and factories with ferocious speed. Within a year, it had 10 million members. Tired of living in a country that worshipped and idealized working class but abused the actual workers, Solidarity's members denounced the corruption and brutality of the party functionaries who answered to the bureaucrats in Moscow. Solidarity's commitment to democracy inspired even party leaders to rebel. A member said, "Once I was so naive as to think that a few evil men were responsible for the errors of the party, and now I know it's the system that needs to change."
Mm-hmm.
Right? We keep coming back to that. It's the system. So in September 1981, Solidarity's members were ready to take their movement to the next stage. 900 Polish workers gathered for their first national congress, and there it turned into a revolutionary movement with aspirations to take over the state with its own alternative economic and political program for Poland. This frightened and infuriated Moscow, so martial law was declared in December of 1981, and Solidarity's members were rounded up by the thousands, and its leaders, including Walesa, were arrested and imprisoned. Solidarity was forced underground, but during the 8 years of police state rule, the movement's legend grew.
Mm-hmm.
By 1988, the terror of the initial crackdown had eased, and Polish workers were again staging huge strikes. This time, their economy was in free fall, and the new moderate regime of Mikhail Gorbachev in power in Moscow, the communists gave in. They legalized Solidarity and agreed to hold snap elections. Now Solidarity split in two, but they still took the election. Authoritarian regimes have a habit of embracing democracy at this precise moment when their projects are about to implode, economic project. And Poland was no exception. So when Solidarity took office, debt was $40 billion and inflation was at 600%. There were severe food shortages in the country and the thriving black market. But all summer, following their triumph, the Solidarity government was paralyzed by indecision because they had no plan.
Mm.
Right? The speed of the collapse of the old order had been shocks and they weren't prepared to deal with those shocks. Solidarity's leaders knew they wanted to put an end to the state's vice-like grip on the economy, but they weren't clear about what they wanted to replace it with. They had no plan. Right?
Mm-hmm.
They knew if the state-run factories were converted to worker cooperatives, there was a chance they could become economically viable, but they had no plan. They came into this with no plan for a new system. Before anything could happen, they needed debt relief, and that was the central mandate of the IMF, to give stabilizing funds. But the IMF was now firmly in the grips of the Chicago School economists, and so they, along with the U.S. Treasury, saw Poland's problems through the prism of the shock doctrine. An economic meltdown and a heavy debt load compounded by the disorientation of the rapid regime change with no plans in place meant that Poland was in the perfect weakened position to accept a radical shock therapy program. The financial stakes were high as the Eastern Europe had not yet been touched by Western capitalism, so there was no consumer market to speak of. So the IMF let the country fall deeper and deeper into debt and inflation. The White House under George Bush Sr. congratulated Solidarity on its triumph over communism while making it clear that the U.S. administration expected Solidarity to pay the debts accumulated by the regime that had banned and jailed its members, and offered only $119 million in aid when the debt was $40 billion. Into the scene walks Jeffrey Sachs, fresh from Bolivia.
Okay.
His plan of shock therapy was even more radical than the one he had imposed on Bolivia. In addition to eliminating price controls overnight and slashing subsidies, he advocated selling off the state mines, shipyards, and factories to the private sector. And when we say private sector, we are not talking about the private individual like you and me that want to start a business. No, we're talking about corporations.
Yeah.
This is what we got to get. What privatization means is corporatization.
Mm-hmm.
This was in total opposition to Solidarity's plans and the power behind winning the election. However, they were desperate for a quick fix. So, and the decision came down to money.
Mm-hmm.
In 1899, a pro-democracy movement exploded in Beijing with mass worship. Skipping to China here. We're going to tie them together.
Okay.
The pro-democracy movement exploded in Beijing with mass protests and sit-ins in Tiananmen Square. The demonstrators wanted democracy and were opposing their government's move towards unregulated capitalism. But in 1980, the president of the CCP had been obsessed with avoiding a repeat with Poland and the workers banding together and winning an election. So he was enthusiastically committed to converting to a corporate-based economy. So committed, in fact, that he invited Milton Friedman to come to China and tutor the hundreds of top-level civil servants. So this
Mm-hmm.
had been going on this training had been going on for 9 years now. Before the Tiananmen Square. The Deng, the president of the CCP, knew that repression would be crucial. So in 1983, he opened up China to foreign investment and reduced protection for his workers. So he also ordered the creation of a 400,000 member army called the People's Armed Police. And on May 20, 1989, then martial law was declared. And on June 3, tanks rolled into Tiananmen Square. As in Latin America, the harshest repression was for the factory workers who represented the most direct threat to deregulated capitalism. After the bloody massacre of Tiananmen Square, Deng addressed the nation and made it perfectly clear that it wasn't communism he was protecting, but capitalism. It was this that turned China into the sweatshop of the world, the preferred location for contract factories for virtually every multinational corporation on the planet. No country offered more lucrative conditions than China, with its low taxes and tariffs, corruptible officials, and a plentiful low-wage workforce. In a strange coincidence, here's where we marry them together, the Tiananmen Square massacre took place on the same day as Solidarity's election sweep in Poland, June 4, 1989. And so we have two more miracles born of massacre. Now we're skipping to another country. In 1990, with Nelson Mandela still behind bars, some people in South Africa, the largest economy on the African continent, still believed that freedom included the right to reclaim and redistribute their oppressors' ill-gotten gains. That belief had formed the basis of the policy of the African National Congress for 35 years, ever since it was spelled out in its statement of core principles called the Freedom Charter. The story of the Freedom Charter's drafting is folklore. It began in 1955 when the party dispatched 55,000 volunteers into the townships and countryside with the task to collect freedom demands from the people, their vision of a post-apartheid world in which all South Africans had equal rights. The demands, of course, were written on scraps of paper, and some were land to be given to all landless people, living wages and shorter hours of work, free education irrespective of color, race, or nationality, the right to reside and move about freely, and many more. So the leaders took all these freedom demands gathered by 55,000 volunteers. Can you imagine the size of this job? That's crazy. we have a hard time getting 50 volunteers together, much less 55,000. So they synthesized it into one document, which was officially adopted on June 26, 1955 at the Congress of the People, held in Kliptown, which was a buffer zone to protect the white people of Johannesburg from the others. Nearly 3,000 delegates of Black, Indian, and colored, a few white people, sat together in empty fields to vote on the contents of the document. And the first demand was that the people shall govern. On Congress's second day, the gathering was violently broken up by the police, who claimed that the delegates were plotting treason. For 3 decades, South Africa's government had been dominated by white Afrikaners and the British, and they banned the ANC and all other political parties that wanted to end apartheid. The Freedom Charter did not go away. It continued to circulate from hand to hand, and in the 1980s, it was picked up by a new generation of militants. They took to the streets chanting, "Neither bullets nor tear gas will stop us." They faced massacre after massacre and buried friends, but they kept singing. When the young militants were asked what they were fighting against, they answered apartheid or racism, and when asked what they were fighting for, their answer was the Freedom Charter. The Charter enshrines the right to work, to decent housing, to freedom of thought, and most radically, to share in the wealth of the richest country in Africa, containing, among other treasures, the largest gold field in the world. It reads, "The national wealth of our country, the heritage of South Africans, shall be restored to the people. The mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. All other industry and trade shall be controlled to assist the well-being of the people." All factions of the liberation struggle knew that the apartheid was not only a political system regulating who was allowed to vote and move freely, it was also an economic system that used racism to enforce a highly lucrative arrangement of a small white elite who had been able to amass enormous profits from South Africa's mines, farms, and factories, because a large black minority was prevented from owning land and forced to provide its labor for far less than it was worth. And they were beaten and imprisoned when they dared to rebel. In mines, the whites were paid up to 10 times more than the blacks, and as in Latin America, the large industrialists worked closely with the military to have unruly workers disappeared. They knew there was no freedom without redistribution. And on February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison a free man after 27 years. When he'd been arrested in 1962, a wave of third world nationalism was sweeping the African continent. And now, when he walked out 30 years later, it was torn apart by war. While he was in prison, socialist revolutions had been ignited and extinguished. Che Guevara had been killed in Bolivia in 1967, Salvador Allende in 1973, Mozambique's liberation hero Samora Machel had died in a mysterious plane crash in 1986. And then the late 80s and early 90s saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, the repression in Tiananmen Square, and the collapse of communism. And now he had a people to lead to freedom while preventing a civil war and an economic collapse. If there was a third path between communism and capitalism, a way of democratizing the country and redistributing wealth at the same time, South Africa, under the ANC, looked uniquely positioned to turn that dream into reality. Anti-apartheidism had become a global movement in the 80s, and outside of South Africa, activists were using corporate boycotts, both of South African-made products and of international firms that did business with the apartheid state. However, in the next 4 years, from 1990 to 94, when the ANC won the election, something had happened to convince the party hierarchy that it could not use grassroots prestige to reclaim and redistribute the country's stolen wealth. So rather than meeting in the middle, the ANC adopted policies that exploded both inequality and crime to such a degree that South Africa's divide is now closer to Beverly Hills and Baghdad, the difference between the two. Today, the country stands as a living testament to what happens when economic reform is severed from political transformation. Politically, its people have a right to vote, and civil liberties and the majority rule. Yet economically, South Africa has surpassed Brazil as the most unequal society in the world. The ANC was in negotiation with the National Party, and one of ANC's big terms was that there would not be an independent central bank in South Africa. Unfortunately, they had to give that up, and everything else that in their Freedom Charter, essentially. So the bottom line was that South Africa was free, but simultaneously captured. And the apartheid activists said, they took the chain from around our necks and put it on our ankles. Part of the reason the grassroots movement didn't demand that the ANC keep the promises of the Freedom Charter and rebel against the concessions made was that when the economic negotiators would report back, the people thought it was too technical. They couldn't understand it, and so they weren't interested. And then most people assumed that no matter what compromises were being made to get into power, they could be unmade once the ANC was in charge. We cannot go down that route. We cannot, you can't, right? What they didn't understand is there would never be a later. Once countries have opened themselves up to the global market's temperamental moods, any departure from Chicago school orthodoxy is instantly punished by traders in New York and London who bet against the offending country's currency, causing a deeper crisis and the need for more loans and more conditions attached. As in Bolivia, once the ANC came into power, their leaders went into backroom secret negotiations, and in the plan that was unveiled, it called for more privatization, cutbacks to government spending, freer trade, and looser controls on money flow. Is there anything different that's going on in the U.S. right now? Same scenario. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission is frequently held up as a model of successful peace building, exported to other conflict zones from Sri Lanka to Afghanistan. But many who are directly involved in the process are deeply ambivalent. When Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the committee's chairman, unveiled their report in 2003, he confronted journalists with freedom's unfinished business. He said, "Can you explain how a Black person who wakes up in a squalid ghetto today, almost 10 years after freedom, and that same Black person goes to work in town, which is still largely white, in palatial homes, and at the end of the day, he goes back home to squalor? Can you explain this as freedom?" He said, "I don't know why these people don't just say to hell with peace and to hell with Tutu and the Truth Commission." A lady named Suka, who heads South Africa's Foundation for Human Rights, says that she feels that through the hearings, though the hearings dealt with outward manifestations of apartheid like torture and disappearances, it left the economic system served by those abuses completely untouched, and echoed the concerns of Orlando Letelier 3 decades earlier. She said, "If I could do this again, I'd do it differently. I would look at the systems of apartheid. I would look at the question of land, the role of multinational corporations, the role of the mining industry, because that is where the real sickness lays. And I would devote only one hearing to torture and human rights, because when you focus on torture, you don't look at what the torture is serving, and that's when you revise history." In the end, South Africa has wound up with a twisted case of reparations in reverse, with the white businesses that reaped enormous profits from the Black labor not paying a cent, and the victims of apartheid sending large paychecks to their former victimizers. And how do they raise money for this generosity? By stripping the state of its assets through privatization, corporatization. Since the ANC took power, the number of people living on less than $1 a day went from 2 million to 4 million, and the unemployment rate doubled. The ANC built 1.8 million homes for their poor, while 2 million others lost theirs. Close to 1 million people were evicted from farms in South Africa's democracy. And now we skip to Russia.
Okay.
By the beginning of the 90s, with his twin policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, Mikhail Gorbachev had led the Soviet Union through a remarkable process of democratization. The press had been freed, Russia's parliament, local councils, president, and vice president had been elected, and the constitutional court was independent. As for the economy, he was moving towards a mixture of free market and strong safety net with key industries under public control. His goal was to build social democracy on the Scandinavian model and socialist beacon for all mankind. At first, it seemed like the West backed him in this. He even won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. So what happened at the G7 meeting in 1991 was totally unexpected. The unanimous message he received from his fellow heads of state was that if he did not embrace the radical economic shock therapy immediately, they would sever the rope and let him fall. What happened next, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev's eclipse by Yeltsin, and the tumultuous course of economic shock therapy in Russia is a well-documented chapter of contemporary history. It's a story told in the bland language of reform, a narrative so generic it has hidden one of the greatest crimes committed against the democracy in modern history. Russia, like China, was forced to choose between a Chicago school economic program and an authentic democratic revolution. Faced with that choice, China's leaders had attacked their own people in order to prevent democracy from disturbing their free market plans. Russia was different. The democratic revolution was already underway. And so in order to push through a Chicago school economic program, that peaceful, hopeful process that Gorbachev began would have to be violently interrupted and radically reversed. He knew the only way to impose this was by force, as did everyone in the West pushing the policy. If you're standing in love and you know you're being a vessel of love, you can't do anything by force. You just wouldn't. Gorbachev did not want to do that, so he soon found himself facing an adversary willing to play the role of Russian Pinochet, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin pulled off a political masterstroke. He formed an alliance with two other Soviet republics, a move that had the effect of abruptly dissolving the Soviet Union and the abolition of the only country most Russians had ever known was a powerful shock to the Russian psyche, and it was the first of three traumatic shocks. Who was behind it? Jeffrey Sachs. Again. Under his tutelage, Yeltsin went to Parliament and made an unorthodox proposal. If they gave him 1 year of special powers under which he could issue laws by decree, does this sound like Mr. Trump? Rather than bring them to Parliament for a vote, he would solve the economic crisis and give them a healthy, thriving system. He, of course, with Jeffrey Sachs' tutelage, lifted price controls and free trade policies and the first phase of rapid-fire privatization of the country's 225,000 state-owned companies. And they unleashed the change quickly to keep resistance impossible. An advisor to Boris Yeltsin explained that the most favorable condition for reform is a weary public exhausted by the previous political struggle. And he went on to say that the vast majority of Russians, 70%, were more opposed to lifting price controls, but we could see that the people then and now were concentrating on the yields of their private garden plots. Right? They were more concerned about their private little life and individual economic circumstances than the bigger picture. And that's what Trump and Musk are still doing. They're still banking on the fact that we're all focused on on building our private little empire, right? That we can't see the bigger picture of what they're doing. A chief economist serving at the World Bank summarized the mentality that guides shock therapists. He said only a blitzkrieg approach during a window of opportunity provided by the fog of transition would get the changes made before the population had a chance to organize and protect its vested interests. As in Poland, Russians did eventually regain their bearings and began to demand an end to the sadistic economic adventure. Yet the West threw its weight behind Yeltsin, who they continued to cast in the role of a progressive, genuinely committed to freedom and democracy, and reform. Russia wasn't a repeat of Chile. It was Chile in reverse order. Pinochet staged a coup, dissolved the institutions of democracy, and imposed shock therapy. Yeltsin imposed shock therapy in a democracy and then could defend it only by dissolving democracy and staging a coup. Both scenarios won enthusiastic support from the West. Democracy is always a hindrance to the free market plan. The chief political analyst at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow from 1990 to 94 said the choice between democracy and markets in Russia was a stark one. He said, "We choose the freeing of prices, privatization of industry, and the creation of a really unfettered, unregulated capitalism, and essentially hoped that the rule of law, civil society, and representative democracy would develop somehow automatically as a result of all that." Russia's communist state was simply replaced with a corporatist one, and the beneficiaries of the boom were confined to a small club of Russians and a handful of Western mutual fund managers. Putin replaced Yeltsin, and his first act as president was signing a law protecting Yeltsin from any criminal prosecution, whether for corruption or for the military's killing of the pro-democracy demonstrators that took place on Yeltsin's watch. So, and you can see I'm skipping over all the torture because we heard it all already from South America.
Okay.
It's all the same. So Yeltsin is regarded by history more as a corrupt buffoon than a menacing strongman. Yet his economic policies and the wars he waged to protect them contributed significantly to the Chicago School Crusade's death toll, which has been mounting steadily since Chile in the 1970s. His wars in Chechnya killed an estimated 100,000. The larger massacres he precipitated took place in slow motion, but their numbers are much higher, the collateral damage of economic shock therapy. By 1998, more than 80% of Russian farms had gone bankrupt and 70,000 state factories closed. In 1989, before shock therapy, 2 million people in the Russian Federation were living in poverty on less than $4 a day. By the time the shock therapy had administered their bitter medicine in the mid-1990s, 74 million Russians were living below poverty line. That meant Russia's economic reforms can claim credit for the impoverishment of 27 million people in only 8 years. By 1996, almost 37 million lived in poverty in Russia, described as desperate. Is Trump going to do that in 4 years here in America? A Moscow academic said that the years of criminal capitalism killed off 10% of their population. The clear goal in Russia was to erase the pre-existing state and create the conditions for a capitalist feeding frenzy, which in turn would kickstart a booming free market democracy managed by overconfident Americans barely out of school. It was Iraq without the explosives and planned misery. That breeds poverty and crime. National salvation through the harnessing of greed was the closest thing Russia's Chicago boys and their advisors had a plan for what they were going to do after they finished destroying Russia's institutions. The entire history of the Chicago school experiment has been one of mass corruption and corporatist collusion between security states and larger corporations, from Chile's piranhas to Argentina's crony privatizations to Russia's oligarchs to Enron's energy shell game to Iraq's free fraud zone. The point of shock therapy is to open up a window for enormous profits to be made very quickly. Today's multinational corporations see government programs, public assets, and everything that is not for sale as terrain to be conquered and seized. What we have been living now for nearly 5 decades is frontier capitalism, with the frontier constantly shifting location from crisis to crisis, moving as soon as the law catches up. Immediately following the Soviet collapse, the U.S. Treasury and IMF became much tougher in their demands for instant privatization from other crisis-racked countries. The most dramatic case today came in 1994, the year after Yeltsin's coup, when Mexico's economy, we just skipped from Russia to Mexico. Mexico's economy suffered a major meltdown known as the tequila crisis. The terms of the U.S. bailout demanded rapid-fire privatization, and Forbes announced the process had minted 23 new millionaires. It also cracked Mexico open to foreign ownership. In 1990, only one of Mexico's banks was foreign-owned, but by 2000, 24 out of 30 were foreign banks. Clearly, the lesson learned from Russia is that the faster and more lawless the transfer of wealth, the more profitable it will be. The one person who understood this was Goni, in whose living room the Bolivian shock therapy plan had been drafted in 1985. As president of the country, now we're in Bolivia. In the 1990s, he sold off Bolivia's national oil company and others. Unlike what happened in Russia, where the biggest prizes were awarded to locals, however, the winners of Bolivia's fire sale included Enron, Royal Dutch Shell, Amoco Corporation, Citicorp, and more, and the sales were direct. The Wall Street Journal described the Wild West scene in La Paz this way. The Radisson Plaza is crammed with executives from major U.S. corporations. They have been invited by the Bolivians to rewrite laws governing the sectors to be privatized and to bid on the companies on the block. I don't think they were invited by the Bolivians. I think they were invited by some very sick people. The important thing for President Goni was to make sure that the changes were irreversibly done before the antibodies kicked in. To make sure those antibodies didn't kick in, Bolivia's government did something it had done before under similar circumstances. It imposed yet another prolonged state of siege that banned political gatherings and authorized the arrest of all opponents of the process. These were also the years of Argentina's notoriously corrupt privatization circus hailed as a Bravo New World. Goni's last months in office were extremely bloody. You can probably speak to that. His privatization sparked.
I was there, actually. Yep. I lived it. The Red October War. Mars was especially bright in the sky that time. And it was around 90 days of blockades. We couldn't get anything but rice and pasta to eat. It was like a miracle to get tomatoes.
Wow.
And then the shock came, and they deployed the military on this. It was so funny. There's a plane coming in, right? And because there was this news cast that was completely free, very amazing. It's like totally like non-corporate channel existed back then, and they would say, they showed they said there's a military American military advisor coming. Okay, so that plane landed. Next day or like 2 days later, they deploy a shock like strategy, because there had been already 2 months of protests on the streets, blockades everywhere, and they wanted Goni out. That's what they wanted, and people were firm in their protest, and so he deployed this shock therapy, and he started shooting people. They killed around 90 people, 90 some people,
Wow.
in the couple days, but they weren't even like protesting. So it was like when the convoys would arrive, everybody would just flee. So they actually had to grab sharpshooters and just shoot people up in the hills that were uh, with their sheep. And we had to bring down this old guy and a little kid that he poked his head outside from a stone. He was hiding, and they would like they had. I mean, it was so clear that they got instructed just kill people.
Just kill people. Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter if they're not even protesting, if they're up in the mountain, just kill people. And did that make it? Did that strategy work? No, it made it worse.
Yeah.
People
Yeah.
got a lot more pissed off, and they finally, Ngani was finally out. He quit
Yeah.
from the plane.
Yeah. He said it says he was forced to, prices soared 300% with a tax war and then a gas war. And then he was forced to flee the presidential palace to live in exile in the US.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So
That was
lawlessness on the frontier is not the problem, it's the point.
Mm.
The Latin American dictatorships of the 70s were rewarded for their attacks on trade unions and their open borders with steady loans, which granted desperate departures, which were granted despite departures from the Chicago school orthodoxy. And then the phrase debt wall entered the vocabulary. So that a sense of crisis can be carefully stoked and manipulated by a handful of think tanks funded by the largest banks and corporations. So by the time the antibodies or humans learn that the crisis was manipulated, things have been done. In 1995, political discourse in most Western democracies was saturated with talks of debt walls and imminent economic collapse, demanding ever deeper cuts and more ambitious privatizations. A man named Davidson Budhu, an IMF staffer turned whistleblower, worked for the IMF for 12 years, where his job was designing structural adjustment programs for Africa, Latin America, and his native Caribbean. He started feeling uneasy after the organization took a sharp turn during the Reagan-Thatcher era. So in 1988, he quit and devoted himself to exposing the secrets of the IMF. He wrote a letter to the IMF in which he said, "To me, resignation is a priceless liberation, for with it I have taken the first big step to that place where I may hope to wash my hands of what in my mind's eye is the blood of millions of poor and starving peoples. The blood is so much it runs in rivers, and sometimes I feel that there is not enough soap in the whole world to cleanse me from the things I did in the name of the IMF." He accused the fund of using statistics as lethal weapons. He documented how, as a fund employee, he was involved in the elaborate statistical malpractices to exaggerate the numbers in IMF reports on oil-rich Trinidad and Tobago in order to make the country look far less stable than it actually was. He claimed that the fund literally invented out of the blue huge unpaid government debts. The gross irregularities were taken as a fact by the financial markets, which promptly classified Trinidad and Tobago as a bad risk and cut off its funding. The country's economic problems, triggered by a drop in the price of oil, its primary export, quickly became calamitous, and it was forced to beg the IMF for a bailout. The IMF then demanded that Trinidad and Tobago accept its deadliest medicine: layoffs, wage cuts, and the whole gamut of structural adjustment policies. He described the process as the deliberate blocking of an economic lifeline to the country through subterfuge, in order to see Trinidad and Tobago destroyed economically first and then converted. And that's where we're going to stop tonight.
Wow. It's just one after the other. So
Yeah.
will we continue with?
Yeah, we're going to talk about the looting of Asia next. And then we're going to go into Iraq, which is, oh my goodness.
That's what you got to live.
Yeah. I mean, talk about erasing, totally erasing, which is what Trump is doing in the Gaza Strip right now.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, so well, let's not leave a moment of silence, or shall we leave a moment of silence? It's almost like, it feels like we should do that
Yeah.
with what we have just covered. But let's not stay in silence. Let's speak out, and we
Okay,
invite
we're
you to do the same thing. To not, if you're listening to this, to come out, say something,
done.
join, do something about it.
We
Don't
will
stay like
not
that.
tolerate this anymore.
We
That's
cannot.
that's our firm line at Owl Council House. Is we will not tolerate this anymore.
Hmm. And so let's invite everyone to continue this research into the next session, which will be next week, same time, right?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
let's go 15 minutes later, because let's go to 7.
Okay. 7 o'clock then.
Yeah.
7 o'clock next week. You're expected here to listen to the continuation of this long presentation of the abyss of the system. So thank you for being here, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah.